Hello, let's look at Remains by Simon Armitage. Now, as you look at the poem, you see the poet at the top first, so let's do a little bit of work on him. Simon Armitage is not a war poet himself. He's writing about one man's experiences. He met up with and wrote this poem alongside a man called Guardsman Tromans. Guardsman is a fairly low rank. He's not a wealthy man. He wasn't a man of power. He was a lowly soldier, and he was fighting in Iraq around about 2003. So we've got a very modern context for this poem. We've got the context of it being a 21st century poem, which is contrasting nicely with, say, Wilfred Owen's poem, although there are a lot of similar themes. Armitage met up with Tromans and two other men to write a collection of poetry called The Not Dead. The Not Dead. That was the name of the anthology he produced, the collection of poetry he produced. So he's written poems about men who went to war and did not die. Armitage was hinting at the fact that when men go off to fight and are killed at war, they are viewed as heroes. When men go off to fight in war and they don't get killed or wounded, but they're psychologically scarred, they're ignored, and they become almost viewed as sometimes as the dregs of society. If you haven't watched it, you should watch the video of Guardsman Tromans talking through his experiences and reading this poem. It will tell you more, probably, about the content and his mental state than you'll learn here. I'm going to do analysis of what Armitage is doing as a craftsman, as a poet. Let's start with the title. Remains has multiple interpretations. It is, of course, what is left over after something. In this case, it's the human body of the man that Guardsman Tromans kills. It's his human remains. But it's also the remains of Guardsman Tromans' mental state afterwards. It's the remains of what stays behind. It's the man he killed remaining inside Guardsman Tromans' mind and haunting him forever. Okay, the poem's very much a poem of two halves. The first half of the poem is Guardsman Tromans' imagined narration of what actually happened, beginning with "on another occasion," which tells us that there'd been more than one experience which had really upset Guardsman Tromans. So that opening is quite interesting in that way. He tells us about when he kills the man, tackling looters, legs it up the road. The man, first time we get the repeated line, or refrain, a repeated line, probably armed, possibly not. And then we have, myself and somebody else are all of the same mind, so all three of us open fire even, all letting fly, rips through his life. The language is very colloquial, meaning quite informal and relaxed in the way the soldiers themselves would speak. So Armitage captures Guardsman Tromans' spoken language style throughout this to make it seem like it's just one of those things that happened. How else does he get the sense of it being one of those things that happened rather than a terrible traumatic event? Well, probably armed, possibly not, is Tromans' justification for this. Probably armed first, because if he was armed, his conscience is clear. Possibly not. That nagging doubt that he's just killed an innocent and unarmed man. The line 5, myself and somebody else, interesting use of pronouns there, particularly what we call the indefinite pronoun of somebody. The indefinite pronoun. He doesn't name the other men who are involved in this. For multiple possible reasons, really. Why not name them? Because he doesn't want them to be blamed for it. Why not name them? Because they're not central to the story. The story is him, the man he killed, and the man he kill's after effects on him. However, when he does start shooting the man, the language becomes highly violent and visceral and grotesque. Actually, it's really horrible. The verb rips through his life. I see, this interesting phrase, broad daylight on the other side, that you can actually see through a body it's been hit with so many bullets. It's disgusting. And the man lies on the ground sort of inside out. So we get very visceral language designed to shock and appall us as readers. Then, for me, there's a slight hint of a change when Armitage writes pain itself, the image of agony, because this metaphor here image of agony, because you can't literally be an image of agony, is quite poetic, and it jars with the rest of this, which is very natural and colloquial in the way that Tromans narrates it. It suddenly becomes a bit more poetic just for a moment, and that could hint that we've got greater depths to the story than we've already heard so far. For me, the first half of the poem ends here with tosses his guts, another absolutely disgusting image, back into his body, and then carted off in the back of a lorry. So that's the experience. The first half of the poem deals literally with the experience. The second half of the poem really changes tack. On line 17, Tromans narrates, end of story, comma, except not really. And this moment here, I'm just going to circle this comma here, this use of caesura, which is a pause in a line of poetry, is for me the crucial moment of this poem, because it's what's called the volta, or turning point of a poem. We are no longer concerned with the event, we're now concerned with the after effects of the event and what it did to guardsmen Tromans. So, Armitage writes, end of story, except not really, because it's not the end of story. We've got all the things that remain afterwards. Blood, shadow, stays on the street. Literally, that could be the pool of blood from where the man died. I don't think it is, though. I think it's every time Tromans walks that street, he sees that man dead again and feels the intense guilt for what he's done. Walk right over it. We've got the phrase, week after week. Home on leave, but I blink, and he bursts again through the doors of a bank. So all these references to things that are just not leaving him when he's asleep, when he's awake, they're always with him. We talked about caesura here. This line here ends with, but I blink, then he bursts again. This is enjambment, when the writer's poetry runs on to the next line. And it creates a sense of him the man who he killed, never leaving him. He blinks and he bursts again. Of course, we've got alliteration there as well, haven't we? Blink, but I blink, and he bursts through the doors of the bank. We've got a lot of plosives here, really increasing the violence. For me, it's interesting that the language has a real sense of violence to it. There's horrible description here, but it feels to me more violent in the second half, like the after effects, or even worse than the actual action of killing the man. The description gets worse too. The verb phrase here, he's torn apart, the man he killed. And he tries to get rid of him with drink and drugs, but they won't flush him out. Really interesting use of verbs in the poem. Armitage seems to be using this phrase, this verb here, flush him out, as a metaphor for getting rid of something out of your system. Think about what you flush away. That's what the man's trying to do. He's trying to flush this man out of his system, the man he killed, and he can't get rid of it. Into here it becomes even more intense. He's here in my head when I close my eyes, dug in behind enemy lines. Look, we've got military language here, dug in behind enemy lines. It's kind of like a military semantic field. Arguably more military here in the memory than when he actually did it here, as he tries to make things as normal as possible here, but he knows when he has to be honest about himself, they're not normal. And we have this really unusual line that stands out here, because it's so much longer than the rest, where he writes, not left for dead in some distant sun-stunned, sand-smothered land, or 6 feet under in desert sand. You'll have heard all the S's there. Some distant, sun-stunned, sand-smothered land, or 6 feet under in desert sand. Lots of sibilance used by the writer, which I think shows Tromans' frustration, his fear, the fact that he's kind of haunted by this whole experience. So the whole experience becomes incredibly haunting for him, and it ends with this final couplet here. Notice it's 4 lines, 4 lines, 4 lines, 2 lines. I'll come back to that in a moment. And he ends with, but near to the knuckle. Here and now. It's not the past. It's now. It's the present. His bloody life in my bloody hands. The repetition of bloody really emphasising not only the violence of it, but Tromans' guilt and his anger at everything that he's been through. Structurally interesting. Now, we've talked about the Volta being a real turning point of the poem, but let's have a look at it. Every verse, 4 lines, 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 2 lines. So it moves from, it's almost entirely in what we call quatrains, 4-line poetry, and it ends with a couplet, 2 lines of poetry. Why? I don't know. Some theories though, not my theories. These are theories some of my students have came up with before in the past. Here, it was a collective thing. It was him and someone else and someone else. And it was the man he killed. There was 4 of them, in fact, in total, so it kind of works. So it's all collective, it's an experience, but by the end, a couplet, why, for me, came from one of my students a couple of years ago, because it's him and the man he killed left with each other forever. So Armitage ends this poem with the 2 of them together. So they'll be there forever. Quite a haunting image, isn't it? Hope that's been helpful. See you later.